Hello and welcome back to the Project Management PrepCast. We are the good, better and best exam preparation course all wrapped up in one. I'm your instructor, Cornelius Fichtner. In this lesson we explain how to find the best answer to each question on your PMI exam. We describe the environment of the test center and the resources that PMI makes available, which you should find helpful on every question of your exam. We give you the best way to manage your time once the exam begins. You should be able to answer all the questions before your time is up for your best chance at a passing score. We introduce the types of questions you encounter, and as a result you will know what to expect and be able to quickly classify what the question is asking you to do. We also explain a few strategic approaches so that you can quickly select the right combination of approaches for each question on the exam. And lastly, we reveal the best way to determine if you are ready to take your exam. But back to the core of our lesson. What does PMI consider to be the best answer? Well, the main concept is that quite often project management is not totally black and white. It's a fact. As a project manager, we can respond in various ways to events, and more often than not, PMI exam questions reflect this and may seem ambiguous, vague, and somewhat unclear. And so even after reading the question twice, you are still not 100% sure you understand what exactly it is describing. Maybe something like a personality conflict on the exam. And in addition to such an ambiguous question, you are also often presented with a challenging list of 4 possible answer choices, like this here, where 2 or even 3 of the available answers look quite correct. For that personality conflict question, you must decide whether to address this conflict directly with the team, or if it would be better to come up with a team-building exercise that may help your team overcome the situation. Your job during the exam is to find not just the correct answer, but the best answer. You may get a question that asks about which document contains a particular detail. If one choice indicates the project management plan and the other a component of the project management plan where both are potentially correct, you should, in this case, select the more precise option, which is the best answer. To that end, you need to approach the exam strategically. Just as a chess player must learn the function and value of each chess piece on the board before they can master the game, so you have to learn the mechanics of taking the exam. During your exam, you will likely encounter a number of different types of questions. Each type of question has its purpose and caveats, which makes knowing how to approach each question crucial. Here are the 5 main question types. We have situational questions, interpretational questions, procedural questions, formula questions, and knowledge-based questions. And since you need to know what to expect from each type, I have some great examples for you. Situational questions pose a project management scenario or story problem like this. You are on a project to outsource vending machine distribution. After the bidder conference, a vendor mentions a requirement that should have been in the RFP. What should you do? These questions test your ability to apply the principles and process flow presented in the PMBOK guide, as well as the standards of responsibility, respect, fairness, and honesty to which we as PMI members are bound under the PMI Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct. Given a scenario, you identify the outcome of how a principle plays out in real life, or choose the right thing to do. In this case, for the sake of fairness, you would inform all bidder conference attendees of a new requirement and invite them to update their proposals. Just as in real life, you will be handed both relevant and irrelevant information. Some questions are short, others are longer. Some speak to the point, others digress. Your task is to read past extraneous details. In this case, the first sentence here, you are on a project to outsource vending machine distribution, sets up the scene but is otherwise irrelevant. Be sure to focus on what the question is asking so that you can identify keywords and numbers that are relevant to the question and eliminate the useless information. Situational questions often require you to use your experience, knowledge, and judgment to answer them correctly. Interpretational questions test your ability to interpret and analyze performance metrics that are common to project management. You may be provided a graphic, diagram, chart, or performance metric values. You have to be able to determine if a good, bad, or neutral interpretation applies. Here is an example. If CPI and SPI are both greater than 1, how well is your project performing? You now have to be able to take that information from the question, interpret what it means, and then determine which of the 4 answer choices is correct. To solve this, you need to know how to use the earned value analysis technique and how these 2 values relate to each other. To prepare for interpretational questions around earned value, we turn to an excellent resource in the PMBOK guide. I'm talking about Table 7-1, which is the earned value calculation summary table. It's on page 267 of the PMBOK guide. In addition to mastering each formula and how it is used, I also want you to focus on the last column, interpretation of results, as it helps you to answer these interpretational questions. You must be actively thinking about project outcomes while studying project performance metrics and the result of formulas. Ask yourself, what would a positive outcome look like compared to a negative outcome? Obviously, this particular resource here from the PMBOK guide mostly focused on exams like the PGMP, the PMP, or the CAPM. If you are studying for the PMI ACP exam, then your interpretational questions will more be focused about agile metrics. For procedural questions, you demonstrate your understanding of what a technique is used for or how a technique is applied. The question may show you a diagram, chart, table, or a text statement of variable values you would use for analysis. Here is an example. The project sponsor has asked for the minimum project duration based on what is known so far. The schedule network diagram is below. Which duration should the project manager report? In order to answer correctly, you need to be able to perform the steps in the relevant method, tool, or technique. In this case, you would have to be able to use the critical path method using the project schedule network diagram. You would need to find the critical path or the sequence of activities that add up to the longest duration. And if this were a question on an agile exam, you probably wouldn't see a schedule network diagram. They would show you a burn down chart, and you'd have to use the burn down chart in order to determine the minimum project duration. You might not need to complete the entirety of the procedure either. Only perform those steps that are required to find the correct answer or to get close enough so that you can guess correctly. One example could be a question that asks you to calculate float for a schedule activity that's on the critical path during planning. If you don't remember that float is always 0 in such a case, you might waste precious minutes drawing an entire project schedule network diagram. As an alternative to performing the steps, procedural questions may ask you to identify how and when the method, tool, or technique is used, or to identify an element that is inherent to the tool. The best way to learn techniques is to use your experience. Certainly, brainstorming is familiar and intuitive. Most students have used this technique. However, performing a forward pass through a network diagram to solve the question here requires more study and practice. Study groups often find it useful to discuss such techniques for each process in the PMBOK guide. Try to recall how you've applied a tool on a previous project, or imagine how it would have helped had you known the tool was available. There are around 50 formulas that you may have to study for the PMP exam, so you can expect to see several formula-based questions. For the CAPM exam, you will be required to be able to perform some basic calculations, and for the PMI ACP exam, you will need to know a completely different set of formulas again. Calculations on the exam are usually quite simple, meant to verify that you know how to apply the formulas properly. Our best advice for these questions? First and foremost, do memorize and do practice key formulas for your specific exam. Second, use the note paper that you are given during the exam. For even the simplest calculations, I recommend that you write it down and ensure that you put the values in the correct order based on the formulas. Lastly, always double check your results with the calculator. For example, what is the cost variance, CV, if the earned value, EV, is 10,000 and the actual cost, AC, is 11,000? Well, that's easy because it's simply 10,000 minus 11,000. That equals positive 1,000. No, wait, I mean negative 1,000. But that's exactly the point I wanted to make here. Write it down and use the calculator. Otherwise, 10,000 minus 11,000 may become a positive number instead of a negative number. Knowledge-based questions require you to apply your understanding of the flow of processes and ITTOs from the PMBOK guide for your PMP and CAPM exam, or values from the Agile Manifesto if you are studying for your PMI ACP exam. You need to know definitions from the lexicon of project management terms and be able to distinguish between similar items based on keywords in their definitions. Here's a more challenging example. With the WES finalized and duration estimates in, what else must you have to build your project schedule? Based on the details provided in the question, you need to be able to infer what process group and what process is being discussed, which requires you to know the flow of processes described in the PMBOK guide. Knowledge questions may also ask you to identify an example or a chart or a list, such as a Pareto diagram, a checklist, or a burn-down chart. Knowledge questions also occasionally ask, what is the exception? For example, brainstorming encourages all of the following, except. You need to understand what makes each process work, including the inputs, tools and techniques, and outputs, documents and methods, in order to properly answer knowledge questions. The knowledge question type is where it's helpful to be intimately familiar with how the processes for each knowledge area fit and flow within the process groups. That is why in each lesson of the Project Management PrepCast, we mark where we are in the table of the project management process groups and knowledge area mapping. It's also helpful to understand what inputs, tools, techniques, and outputs are being used in the scenario described in the exam question. These are helpful for your PMP and CAPM exam. You don't need to memorize the ITTOs by heart, but you must have a good grasp of which ones are used where and how. Our best advice to prepare for all the Book of Knowledge questions is twofold. First, practice a brain dump of the process map table until it takes you 10 minutes maximum. Practicing the process mapping table is an effective way to ingrain the flow of the processes in your mind. Also, create flashcards of terms and definitions that you have trouble distinguishing. Again, I do not recommend that you memorize the ITTOs, but you should understand why each of them is important to the flow of processes. Our lessons of the Project Management PrepCast provide specific examples for each input, tool, technique, and output to ensure that you can recognize what's going on in a knowledge type question. Let me recap the 5 question types with a twist, because depending on which credential you're pursuing, the type of question that you see on your exam may be different. PMP candidates have all of these types of questions: situational, interpretational, procedural, formula, and knowledge. CAPM candidates will see a subset based on the types of objectives that are listed in the CAPM exam content outline. CAPM candidates will see a subset of these based on the types of objectives listed in the CAPM exam content outline. CAPM candidates are less likely to have to solve procedural questions. They need to apply fewer formulas and fewer interpretations. Of course, plenty of process and ITTO questions are on the CAPM exam. And since all PMI members are bound by the Code of Ethics and Professional Conduct, you can expect to see those type of questions on every single exam. And this concludes our discussion of the types of questions that you'll see on your PMI exam. You should now be able to quickly classify exactly what each question is asking you to do. Our next challenge is to examine approaches to selecting the best answer. If you meet the requirements to apply for a PMI credential, I assume that you have at least gotten through high school or maybe even university. Therefore, you should be familiar with an ordinary approach to answering multiple choice test questions. That is, you start out by reading the story problem and the question. Then you have to sort out what facts and details are important to what the question is actually asking. Here it is critical to ignore the extraneous, irrelevant detail that may distract you from answering the question. Then make absolutely sure that you have a solid grasp of what the question wants to know. Then you read the available answer choices. You begin by eliminating the wrong answer choices. Often 2 of the 4 answer choices are clearly wrong and can be eliminated. Then you weigh the 2 remaining answer choices against each other and you pick the one that seems like the best answer and you make it your choice. There is nothing wrong with this familiar approach. Hey, it got us all through our entrance exams, midterms and finals. But we're all grown up now and we need to get through a PMI exam. So, while we continue to use these skills here, our approach needs to be a bit more mature. Here is an introduction to a more strategic set of approaches tailored for PMI exams. Many exam-taking tips and tricks have been out there for years, and we've categorized them into 4 strategic groups for you. We start with a quick overview here, and then we look at each in turn. The MGM approach, which stands for Mark, Guess, and Move On, helps you manage your time throughout the exam. Focus approaches use the length of the story problem and the choices to determine where you should read closely first. The shorter, the better. Highlight and strike-through approaches help you keep what is important in mind and hide what you can ignore, so it won't distract you from the right answer. And lastly, calculating approaches help you fly through questions with formulas, analyses, and diagrams. By understanding these 4 approaches, you'll be able to apply the right one on the fly as you work your way through the exam questions. Remember, you are trying to average about 60 seconds per question so that you have some time left at the end for a review. To manage your time, the best strategy is to postpone questions that are long and complex. Watch out for these 2 things especially. Project schedule network diagrams take well over 1 minute to draw, and unfamiliar formulas are susceptible to errors and rework. So when you come across such long, complex or confusing questions, you just use the MGM method. That means mark, guess, and move on. So go ahead and use the mark feature on the exam and then pick whichever answer choice seems to be the best at the time. Yes, guess. Just go ahead and take a stab at the answer. For PMI exams, there is no penalty for guessing. Any question which you do not answer, however, counts as incorrect. But if you at least guess, well, then you have a 25% chance of getting it right. So pick one, and if you have any specific thoughts or ideas in your head, jot them down for later. Then move on to the next question on the exam and come back to this question here during your review at the end. The MGM approach manages your time during exam and lets you focus on questions where you easily demonstrate mastery. However, don't do this too often. The more questions you mark, the more you have to review at the end. And speaking of focus, one of the first things you notice about a question as it appears on the screen is how long the question is or how short the answer choices are. Of course, the shorter the better. For short questions, as you can see here on the right-hand top, use the head-first approach. With short questions, let your eyes focus on it, read it, and then make up the answer in your head before you even take a look at the answer choices. And as you go through the answer choices, you simply match the ones that you had in your head. But when you see that the answer choices are really short as compared to the question, as you can see here in the middle, we have the choices first approach. In this case, read the short answer choices first, then read the final sentence of the question so you know what is being asked, then read the whole question. This approach focuses on your short-term memory, keeping brief answer choices in mind while you use the question and facts in the story, so to speak, to sort out which choice fits best. As you read the choices, you may find yourself gravitating toward one or two, and your first impression is usually right. Use that intuition based on your experience and practice to your advantage. When the length of the story and the answer choices are about equal, as you see here at the bottom, we have the question first approach. Skip the first part of the question, the one that sets up the scene with possible extraneous detail. Instead, look first for the ask at the end of the question. Make sure that you grasp what the question is looking for. Now continue with the ordinary approach of answering these questions. With this trio of focus approaches, you'll quickly be able to zoom in on specific areas to analyze the question and answers. For both the highlight and strike-through approaches, which are next, make sure that you go through the tutorial before you start the exam so that you learn how to use these features. And in regards to highlight, you'll learn that you can click to highlight keywords, which makes them easier to find and keep in mind while you are reading the next sentence, or when you come back to a marked question during your review at the end. When two answers seem correct, highlight their differences. In the case of two answers that seem to both be correct, compare the differences to determine which one is the best answer. Some questions will include negatives, such as not, except, and all but. By highlighting that negative, you make sure you don't miss it. And lastly, always highlight absolutes. Make sure you consider the restrictive nature of an answer that contains always, all, every, never, none, or only. These answers may look good, but remember, absolutes are a dangerous area because there can always be exceptions to them. Project management is never black and white. And in the tutorial, you will also learn that you can right-click to strike out answer choices that you wish to ignore. Striking choices makes them more difficult to read. In effect, it sort of hides them, as you can see here. It's really hard to read those two words, strike through, because, well, they're strike through. Eliminating any answer that you know are not correct in this way is a good idea, because there are going to be times when you are going to be able to completely eliminate an answer or two, which will make answering the question a lot easier because you have a couple of answers less to worry about. Doubt any answer choices that use unfamiliar words. If an answer choice does not seem familiar to you or doesn't seem to fit with what you have seen in the PMI standards like the PMBOK guide, the language, the terminology, there is a good chance that this choice is a wrong answer. Highlighting and striking through are powerful support tools for your short-term memory. It helps you keep what is important in mind and hides what you can ignore so that it won't distract you from the best answer. For our calculating approaches, your preparation begins with practice. As I've said, PMI expects you to have many formulas memorized, particularly true for the PMP exam, or otherwise have years of experience using the formulas so that you can solve any formula questions with no trouble. To prepare, you may wish to add formulas and mnemonic devices to help you remember them to your daily brain dump practice. And you may want to practice solving formula questions on paper and with a calculator. If you can, practice with an on-screen Windows calculator application as well, because this is what you're going to be using during the exam. This practice prevents a common cause of anxiety and errors during the exam. If you are familiar with the formula, then don't look at the answers at all. calculate it out, do the math first. And once you have the solution and you have double-checked your math with the calculator, look at the available answers to find the match to your solution. If you are not familiar with the formula, then maybe work the problem backwards. Take the first possible answer and see how well it fits with the details in the story, in the question. Going through the answer choices this way, you can ask yourself, which answer can I actually prove? The key to calculating approaches is adequate practice and studying of the terms and values that you may see in formula questions. Once you get to the end of the exam, hopefully you have a few minutes to review the items that you marked when you used the MGM approach. You should have answered all the questions at this time. If not, then go to the review screen, and with a bird's eye view of all the questions and their status, you can filter to the ones that are unanswered. You should revisit the unanswered ones first and answer them so that you have all questions answers. That gives you the best chance at scoring well. Then filter the list again and show only the marked items. Look over your notes on the question IDs and types, and then prioritize based on topics or question type, knowing how much time you have left for doing the review. Fix the quickest ones first and save all the complex formulas and network diagrams for last. After 4 hours, your memory might have had quite a workout, so highlighting and striking through are now your best friends to support your short-term memory. As you are doing the review, you may be tempted to second-guess yourself. That is only natural. But oftentimes, your first guess is intuitive, drawing from your experience and studies. Changing your initial guesses should only happen when you have a really good reason, such as newfound clues in the text, or if checking the formula and calculations uncovers an error and you are sure that the change is needed. Remember that you have invested a lot of time studying for this exam. That can't have been for nothing, so select the answer that seems to be the most logical for you. The step of reviewing marked items is actually part of the MGM, the mark, guess and move on approach, and it is a crucial part. With a bit of luck and focus, you should have managed your exam time to make the most of this approach. I'm going to finish this lesson by answering the question that almost every single one of my students asks. The question is, of course, when do I know that I'm ready to take the exam? And frankly, that is a difficult question to answer because most of us never feel ready. But there is one solid metric that you can use: the percent of questions that you answer correctly the first time. Here's what you have to do. Practice on sample exam questions that you have never seen before and keep track of your score, for example in a spreadsheet. After some time, you will be able to analyze the data and see if you are consistently scoring 80% or more. If that is the case, you may be ready. However, please consider that this 80% rule is a mere guideline. It's not a guarantee that you will pass. Everyone is different, your mileage may vary, but you can stack the odds in your favor in this way. But here is the one thing that I have to stress with this approach. It is really important to practice on question sets that you have never seen before. Here's a story to illustrate my point. This stellar student here kept track of her progress as she practiced on this 50 free sample questions exam. You can see that she noted the percentage of correctly answered questions on the right-hand side each time that she repeated the same sample exam. What you notice is that the first time she answered the 50 free questions, she only got 60% correct. Then she tried the same questions again, she got 80% correct. And finally, on her third try using the same 50 questions, well, she got 94% correct. The same pattern happened with another sample exam of 120 free questions. Her scores improved from 77 on the first try to 89 on the second try and to 96% on the third try. All with the same 120 questions, of course. But such a remarkable improvement wasn't because she mastered more knowledge between each try. No, it's merely because she remembered the correct answer from the previous attempts. As a rule, only the first attempt counts on these practice exams. And that is because when you take the actual exam, you only get one try as well. You have to be able to get it right the first time. So, my advice is simple. Don't answer the same questions multiple times. Our next student here has chosen to take several full 4-hour, 200-question sample exams in preparation of her PMP exam. However, she has stopped trying to take the same exam multiple times. You can notice how her scores are, however, still increasing there, from the first simulator exam at 74 to 87 in the fourth. How does she manage to consistently score above 80% there? Well, I'll tell you. Once she is done with the exam, she analyzes the knowledge area where she scored most poorly. She studied the explanations on the questions that she got wrong, and then she looks up the relevant topics in the PMP guide and other standards, maybe even in her study prep book, to understand what she did wrong and to better get into the PMI mindset and approach. Next time that she takes a sample exam, she is answering questions from a different set that she has never seen before, but because of this continuous preparation and improvement, she can repeat these steps until she maintains a score of 80% or better consistently. That is what we are talking about. This student here may consider herself to be ready to take the exam. Will she pass? We don't know. The numbers, however, look good. I always say and recommend that you cannot be adequately prepared without taking at least 6 full 4-hour simulated exams, specifically for the PMP exam, to ensure that you have the stamina and confidence to pass the exam. Frankly, I would therefore advise her to maybe try 3 more. But at least like this, she has a performance indicator so she can guide herself. And you can certainly do the same. Did you know that PMP doesn't just stand for Project Management Professional, it also stands for Practice Makes Perfect. Yes, practice makes perfect, PMP. So if you want to pass your exam, it's most important to practice answering questions similar to what you will see on the exam. Not just the PMP, CAPM, PMI, ACP, PGMP, you name it. As part of your subscription to the PM PrepCast, you have access to a small number of self-assessment questions at the end of each major module. However, these questions primarily help you track how well you understood and retained the material, the knowledge from that module. You can use the results to identify areas where you need to apply some more studies of processes and concepts in the PMBOK guide. After you complete the PrepCast, try some free PMP questions or apps. They are readily available across the internet, but please make sure you use a reputable provider only. Free is good, but I maintain that you cannot really adequately prepare without 6 full 4-hour simulated exams for your PMP exam. It's a few less for CAPM and PMI ACP. So to ensure that you have the stamina and confidence to pass the exam, you need to move on to a high-quality system like our very own PM exam simulator. The more practice you have, the easier it is to identify the best answer, no matter what the topic or question type. Your takeaways from this lesson are simple and logical. Manage your studies to maximize your test time. In order to finish on time with the best score, you want to be able to average about 60 seconds per test question. Purely mathematically, you have 1.2 minutes for each question on the PMP and CAPM exam, but you want to be a little faster so that you have time left over at the end for a review. Get familiar with the types of questions in a PMI exam: situational, interpretational, procedural, formula, and knowledge. To pick the best answer, as you practice sample sets of questions, use the 4 strategic approaches we introduced you to. MGM, or mark, guess, and move on. Focus on what is short first. Highlight and strike out. And finally, the calculating approaches. And consider signing up for the PM Exam Simulator. You can find it at www.pmexamsimulator.com for the premium paid version, and free.pmexamsimulator.com if you want to take the simulator for a 7-day test drive to see if you like it. And just to be clear, while I would appreciate it if you use my own simulator, the most important thing is really that you do use one, no matter the provider. And then you need to keep up the practice and apply a study cycle for success. Begin by finishing your PM PrepCast studies. Then supplement this by taking practice exams. In these exams, you will definitely answer a few questions incorrectly, so you want to analyze in particular those questions that you missed. In that way, you can understand what the problem was, and then you can repeat your studies until you see a steady improvement and hit that magical 80% consistently. And that concludes our lesson on finding the best answer on your certification exam. Until next time.